Hello, in this video we're going to be moving around a bit, looking at some strange connections pretty much crossing a lot of parts of the world and lots of history. It's sort of like a follow-on response to a recent upload by Hornby Island Mysteries regarding Australia and the Mount Kilauea volcano. I'll put the links to the description in there. Please have a look at his channel and his work. He's got some interesting stuff, and also put a link to Geof Lewis' channel, who's basically on the same path there. So very much related to what I do, but complements it. So anyway, ancient temples. So let's begin. We got Indonesia and Prambanan Temple. It's one of these ancient temples. Some interesting. I've touched on it briefly in some longer videos. I just quickly went over it. But so, for instance, that central tower. Now it's either 153 or up to 154 feet. Because it's been rebuilt, there's always going to be a question mark over it. The smaller towers on either side are 108 feet. They've been rebuilt, so a question mark, but the width of those is 66 feet. The footprint is still there. This is a very important number, but I'm not going to be talking about numbers in this one. I'm going to be looking at temple plans and some very strange connections. If you see how that square that it's designed, well, that's basically, it's the Vastu Shastra. It's an ancient Indian architectural technique in regards to the size, proportions, and measures of temples, very much connected to the mandala. This is, so it's in India, but like for instance, another important temple in Indonesia is Borobudur. Again, the same numbers and connections you'll find. So you know the numbers of bells and numbers of Buddhas. You're always going to come back to the same sets. 72, 432, exactly the same. Well, the same sets of numbers you find all over the world, all across ancient temples. This concept of the temple plan is usually credited to the Babylonians, basically early, that there's a set temple plan, but well, some suggest that the Vastu Shastra, the Hindu plan, goes back possibly 6,000 years, possibly even more, and there's quite a bit of good evidence for that. But speaking about temple plans and design, now we'll sort of skip forward a bit and we're going to have a look at Rome. Survey was very, very important. It was a very high art, very much respected art, a very important part of, well, Greco-Roman, but especially the Romans. So we see some, like, for instance, a tomb here of a surveyor, and the temple plans and the city plans in which the Romans made were very consistent with, again, these cultures across the world going back quite some time before them. And so the importance of designing a city properly and designing it along certain measurements and certain lines is a constant. This is well documented. This is not some sort of out there sort of thing. It's just sort of overlooked because the implications for it are quite game changing for the standard model of history. And the Greeks and the Romans, they would, this is a Hermes stone, as Herm as in Hermes, and well, it's a hermaphrodite. It has a female body with a male penis. Well, the word hermaphrodite and Hermes very much connected, because Hermes had one of the trickster gods. He sort of had this duality, this dual aspect to his personality, very similar to Buddha, who has sometimes depicted very feminine because sometimes very male, but he has this duality. Like some gods have this way to they transcend gender. They can be one or another. They sometimes have a male aspect, sometimes have a female aspect, depending on the needs of the time, the way they're reacting to the certain situation as well. But so you have the mandala, the Vastu Shastra, this very important temple plan used in Hindu and Buddhist architecture, going back very, very long time, possibly 6,000 years or more. The Templum of the Sky. So this is a drawing of the Roman town planning principles, which was very much connected to astronomy and, well, the Milky Way. So in Rome now, I forget the name of a street in Rome, but in London we have Watling Street, which is basically represents the Milky Way, and this is again a common theme going back to Roman times. And this, as you can see, so here's a cleaned up version of the Roman city plan. So it pretty much is east, west, north, south. now, why they did that, some very obvious and practical reasons, but if you go further into it, you'll see that there's quite a bit of, well, let's say spirituality, the measurements they use, the proportions. It's not just because it's a bog standard design, it's quite a bit in there, and there's some really good PDFs, books and stuff. So if you basically have a look into ancient survey. But now we're at Kilauea, Hawaii, and the volcano here. This is relevant, and again I'll put the link to Hornby Island Mystery and his recent upload regarding this, because, well, he's talking about Canberra in Sydney, which Canberra in Australia, capital city, which is the equivalent of Washington, Brasilia, or Astana, and he links it to, there's some really, it's a bit way out there, but the fact is that it just keeps popping up, and at some point coincidence stops being coincidence, and you have to look at things with a different mindset. But so we're marking out the volcano itself has where it is now, and I've pointed out, so it's 155 and 19.52 degrees. That sort of it connects to the Hornby Island Mystery, because he talks about this connection with the pentagram and phi, and how this plan is in Canberra, and I've done some videos on Canberra as well. But now we're going to Mexico City. That cathedral you saw was built on an older pagan temple, which was a practice that very often. But okay, Mexico City. Now we see, so there's 16 radiating streets that are clear to see, but this in itself is another very important and very much repeated plan going through time. So what we have here is, what we're really pointing out to is like a central point with the 16 radiating beams. Old Portolan maps such as the Peri Reis map, these very famous ancient maps which depict Antarctica and the Americas well before Columbian before Columbus come along. So again, this history that we're taught in regards to Antarctica and these other places, it's just nonsense. Like these ancient map makers have very clearly drawn the Americas, Australia, and Antarctica centuries and centuries before the current, before official history will recognise. But okay, in Astana, this is like the equivalent of Canberra, Washington, or Brasilia. You see that this 32 around the 33rd point is repeats often. Again, you see it's St. Paul's in London. I've got like a collection of these. It's just all over the world. It's really, it's there, especially connected to Masonic temples and places like that. Not exclusive to them, because as we've seen, this is goes back centuries and centuries, thousands of years. The UN map 32/33, and the Portolan map. So this 32/33, very important. But I showed earlier, the Portolan map and maps will actually lead to this 32 around the 33rd central point. But they'll use begin with 16. So as we see back to Mexico City, so these 16 radiating streets. Well, the geometry is actually pointing to the 32/33. This is just like the Portolan maps. You got to just sort of the geometry is there anyway. So make of that of what you will. There's plenty of other examples in regards to this. I'm not just extrapolating. It's a common theme. I should have spent more time collecting the examples, but I've done it in other videos, so I'm going to move on from there. Back to Mexico City, the cathedral built over the older pagan site. When the Spaniards come to Tenochtitlan, as it was called, they thought that the Romans had been there, because they noticed that this older town plan system, just like the Roman town plan, was built into the Mexican, as what is now Mexico City, which was surrounded by a Lake Texcoco, I think is the pronunciation, if I've got it wrong. But now we see a map of modern Mexico. The lake has since been drained, and we'll get to make so since after the Spaniards arrived and after the conquest. But now we start zooming in, and it was directly in the middle of the screen. You might see like a little circle, but as we move in closer, that's called the El Caracol, or the Caracol, which is a Spanish word for snail. It's this spiral that's built into the lake. Some very, very interesting points in regards to this. But I mentioned earlier Mount Kilauea, 155 degrees west, 19.25. Well, the center of this snail is at exactly 99 degrees west and 19.25 0.25 degrees north, so exactly 56 degrees from Mount Kilauea. Now you have to remember that Hawaii is slowly moving, so I think it's not. I wouldn't 100% put my name to this, but that it's moving as well, and that it's so close that it's you're really talking like a small fraction, and the volcano has been moving, so it'd be interesting to consider. But anyway, it's still worth putting out there. This is a re-upload basically of an earlier video with some extra information. I'll put the links in there as well, because since that earlier video I've got a couple little extra tidbits, and I didn't connect it to some other important places such as the Asian temples, Vastu Shastra, Temple to Plan, but also I want to put, so some sources say that the Caracol, the snail, was there when the lake was drained. Some say that it was built later, so in the 70s to spirulina. So some pause. Sorry, I just had to pause just to extend this picture out now. Some interest. Well, this spiral, the snail. Some sources say that it was there earlier. Some say it was built in the 60s or the 70s. But the important point is that it was this spiral is said to be used for the harvesting of spirulina. The lake there in Mexico, now Mexico City, was one of the only sources of it back in the day. Now it's harvested and grown on a larger scale, but it was used as a supplement by the ancient peoples of Mexico, and it's since then it was used to, this spiral was used to harvest it, but again since then industrialized farming and other methods, now they can grow it in tanks and vats and stuff like that. But back at that time it was had to be harvested from here. Now let's assume that this is correct in that it's relatively modern. Now some will say that it was actually there before. Some say that the harvesting started then. But when I tried to, anyway, we'll put that to the side and let's just assume that it's relatively modern. Okay, so but well, there's more interesting connections in there, and so where were we going? Okay, the spiral. Well, there are other interesting links in regards to this particular spiral, or the snail as it's called, and we'll get to them shortly. But anyway, so just that you see this, it's in the middle of Mexico City, the highest capital city in the world. It was an ancient site as well, and that it's at this, well, very auspicious, let's call it, position and number of degrees in regards to well, exactly 99, and then the Mount Kilauea. But the interesting part is that the facility itself, the pumping and the water operations which are done there, is owned and operated by the HERMES Group of companies. Why Hermes? Well, Hermes, just the Hermstone, as I'll review those in a second. Hermes, the hermaphrodite, which is Mercury, the trickster god. Hermetic architecture, this hermetic design, the hermetic code, the hermetic plan going back some time. And again, it's these patterns crossing the world. But it's interesting to note that how often these things will sort of match up with each other. Now on their own they're just like a nice little coincidence, but as you get more and more through it, you just see this again, the same numbers, the same people, the same names, the same symbols popping up again and again. But there's another very interesting, almost a little bit strange connection in regards to the Hermes company, and I have to be careful with who I talk about at the moment, but think of someone who's very rich, one of the richest men in the world, and I can't really, I have to be careful with what I say about this, but there's there have been allegations, let's say, some very, very serious allegations, and I'll leave it at that. But okay, the Hermes companies also runs a series of, notice the shell, secrets, resorts and spas. This is like an adults-only fantasy resort. Will give you whatever your fantasy is. They will provide it for you, and I'll leave that at that. But what we have is a trail of money. It's like stuff I want to say, but I shouldn't say, and I have to be careful with what I say. But anyway, on Google Map, here's like an interesting thing. The streets around there also have astronomical names. Now, something weird come up, like when I marked it, and the Google Maps information comes up. So you've seen the bottom left there, like a close-up. Okay, here you can see it better. Now, that I found that rather curious, rather interesting, because at that same time that I was looking into this, I was also looking into Sudan and a site there which very much matches the Karnak Luxor temple plan. But anyway, if you're into your Google Earth, get this position, look at Sudan. But okay, so that strange script on Sagittarius Street, I couldn't recognize it. So what I did, so there we see it. So so that script, it's rather unusual, and so I'm hoping someone might have some information on this. So I'm not saying what I know, what I assume. Anyway, what I did was I took the script and dropped it into Google Translate, and what I got was that it was detected to be Sudanese, and the translation I got back into English was exactly the same. And there are some vaguely familiar symbols there, one or two of them, but not all of them, and perhaps someone who's watching might have some information on this, and there are some connections to Sudan that I should have explored before I put this together. But anyway, anyway, if you're into your Google Maps and your Google Earth, you might want to have a look into the position of Sudan related to Kilauea and the Caracol facility here in Mexico City. And so pretty much, okay, that's pretty much the video. It's a follow-up. I had a bit of extra information to add to the earlier one. I'm hoping some people will be able to read between the lines and identify some individual that I mentioned and the allegations, let's say, that have been spinning around him. But with that, I'll leave it. Now, it's please, if you got some like in regard, there might be some good, very simple explanation for that particular type of script and why Sudan was brought up there, and I'd be very keen for that information. But please have a look at the description, because this was I was inspired to redo this by a Hornby Island mystery, a recent upload. And I'll also put a link to another Aussie here, Geof Lewis, who looks in Hornby Island mysteries, and Geof Lewis. They're basically on the same path, which is different from mine, but it's complementary to it. So with that, I hope you enjoyed and have a good one.